Okay, super stuff. I think we'll get going. I think I've seen the number of people joining to come to a halt. So I think we have everybody on the line. And again, thank you to you all for making the time for this session. My name is Neil Cullen. I'm Director of Compliance Learning here at Interactive Services, and I'm joined on the line by my colleague Paddy McGovern, who's our Head of Compliance Content here. We're both based out of our offices here in Dublin. And again, just by way of introduction, what we had hoped to cover on the session was just to give you a 90-second bit of background on who we are and on what we do, and I guess how we've come to this point in offering GDPR training and some of the background there. We'll then just do a very quick recap on what GDPR actually is, in case there's anybody on the line who needs a bit of a refresher. I'd imagine you're all pretty familiar at this stage, and some of you probably have it coming out your ears at this point. But just in case there is anybody on the line who needs a quick recap of what it is and what the impact of the GDPR is, we'll cover that off. And then we'll really get into the nuts and bolts of GDPR training, why it's important, who needs to be trained, how we go about developing that training, and we'll do a Q&A with Paddy around that as well. Paddy, do you want to maybe just give the people on the line a quick intro as to who you are and what your role is here in Interactive Services?
Yeah, sure, Neil, no problem. My role here is the Head of Compliance Content Strategy. So my focus is on the content that goes into our compliance training, the instructional design methodology we use. So I primarily focus on dealing with the clients we have and then researching new topics that we need to add to our library. And when we do that, working with our legal partner to ensure all the content is legally valid before we put it into any of our training.
Super stuff. Thanks, Paddy. So I guess just 90-second recap on who we are. We're headquartered here in Dublin, Ireland. We're a learning and development company by background, and our clients and our offices are split between companies in the US and companies here in Europe. And as I mentioned, the focus really today is going to be on UK companies and European companies and how GDPR impacts your companies from a training point of view. But just to say that we do have a large global presence. We work with companies across the globe. We work with companies from different industries and different backgrounds, and our focus really is on compliance training. So we're a learning and development company by background. We've built a compliance training product, of which GDPR is a significant component. And just to give you a bit of background, Paddy, you might just help us explain here how our GDPR training has come about, how we added it and why we added it to the library, and maybe just touch on how we've separated out the sort of core GDPR training piece versus the role-specific topics as well.
Sure, Neil, no problem. So back maybe this time last year, back 18 months ago, every year we do a legal review of all our content with our legal partners, and they will kind of make recommendations around, any upcoming legislation that might be an area that we'd want to cover in our training. And obviously, going back 12 months ago, the GDPR was a hot topic. So that was one area that we identified with them that we needed to create training on. So once we had identified that need, we did a lot of research into what exactly the GDPR was, what we would need to cover from a training perspective. So we'd sit down and analyze at a very high kind of broad level for a global type organization what their staff would need to know about the GDPR. So we look at it firstly from the perspective of what all employees would need to know about the GDPR, and then we drill down a little bit further and had to think about what areas in particular, what roles in particular would see a significant impact because of the GDPR. And we spoke to a lot of our current clients, we spoke to our legal partners about this, and that's where the GDPR expansion pack here came from. So roles like of HR, where they deal with employee data on a frequent basis, IT, where they are concerned about the security of data, the likes of procurement and the supply chain, where they're dealing with vendors, and marketing, obviously, where marketeers will run marketing campaigns, collect people's data, etc. So they were kind of the five key areas we identified that that the GDPR would have a significant impact on them, and that's why we decided to create role-specific topics for those individual roles. So what we find a lot of clients will do is they will take our core offering and give that to all of their employees, and then they might take the HR topic as well, and only their HR staff would get that topic in addition to the core ones.
Yep. Yep, thanks, Paddy. And I guess the one thing to say in addition to that is that each of the, I guess, bullet points that you see there represents about 5 minutes worth of content. So clients do have the flexibility to pick and choose the content that's most relevant to them. And they have the flexibility to, I guess, pick and choose and mix and match based on what the requirements are. And we will get into that in a bit more detail in a couple of minutes, just in terms of how we go about doing that sequencing and how we choose what topics and what content is relevant. But I guess, Paddy, maybe just as I mentioned, for those on the line who may just need a little bit of a refresher on what GDPR is. I mean, I'm sure most people are familiar with it at this stage, but just in case there is anybody on the line who needs a bit of a refresher on what it is and what GDPR is and how it impacts different organizations, you might just give us a quick summary of the headlines and the highlights there.
Yeah, sure, Neil, no problem. So, I mean, at a very high level, the GDPR really strengthens the data privacy rights of individuals in the EU. So it really is focused on how companies gather and handle personal data and how they protect it. So when it comes into effect in a couple of months, these additional rights for data subjects will come into effect. We'll end up with a standardized data protection regime across the EU, and there'll be an obligation on businesses to make privacy by design a key element of all business processes. So another key factor in it is personal data has been widened to include like IP addresses, cookie identifiers, stuff like that. So for example, if you're a global company, it doesn't matter where you're based, and you track cookies of anyone that visits your website. If EU visitors visit your website, you track their cookies, and their data then falls under the GDPR. So you have to adhere to the GDPR data privacy requirements. So that's really at a very high level, and I'm sure everyone on the call really understands what it is. So there is going to be an onus on companies to strengthen their data protection regimes, make their employees aware of how important the GDPR is and the consequences that could come into effect, the consequences of non-compliance that could befall any company that doesn't adhere to the GDPR.
Yeah, you've touched on it there, Paddy. And I mean, one of the points that we've just brought up on the screen here is about the fines. So organizations in breach of GDPR, it can be up to 4% of the annual global turnover of the company, or 20 million euro, whichever is greater. So the fines are very significant in this instance. And I mean, obviously today our focus is on the training piece, but GDPR impacts on the entire business, your business processes, how you go about your business. So it is pretty significant. And then you touched on it there, Paddy, that it's not just UK or EU companies who are impacted by this, that it could be US companies or European companies who have offices abroad who could be impacted on this as well. So, I mean, if we were to take an example of, let's say, a French company who has an office in Singapore and employees in Singapore, are clients typically training those employees, or are they focusing more on the employees here in Europe?
Well, they would be training any employees that have anything to do at all with handling personal data. So if you have an office, you're headquartered in France, you might have an IT department in Singapore that handles data from your EU customers. Those IT staff in Singapore would need to be trained on the GDPR. So I suppose at the bottom line is that any company worldwide, if they have any EU customers, clients, employees, they need to train on the GDPR, or they need their staff to be aware of the GDPR and what they need to do to adhere to it.
Yep, that makes sense. Great. So, I mean, we'll get into the detail of the training on the next slide, but what does the GDPR guide in terms of training? So, are there specific detailed recommendations? Are there guidelines? Is it mentioned
Yeah.
briefly, or how exactly does that work? And what are the typical requirements from a company's point of view around GDPR training?
Yeah, so the GDPR legislation itself doesn't mandate any specific set training requirements. So it doesn't say you need to train all your staff for 30 minutes or an hour every year on the GDPR. What it does do, though, is it calls out that one of the responsibilities of the data privacy officer is to raise awareness and train staff involved in processing operations around the GDPR. So basically, anyone that handles personal data in any way, shape, or form should receive general awareness training on the GDPR. So what we, bearing that in mind and speaking for our legal partners, what we generally recommend is that all staff should take training on the GDPR, say in year one, so that would be 2018, and then in subsequent years you would have follow-up refresher training, and you could tailor that refresher training then to the roles within your organization. So it would be very important probably for your, say, HR, procurement, marketing staff to get regular training, regular refreshers on the GDPR, whereas other staff could probably do with a very light touch in years 2 or 3 training-wise on the GDPR. But we would generally recommend that all companies would implement GDPR training in 2018 so that all staff are aware of it. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, you can tailor that training to the specific roles within your organization, so that, say, some staff that have very little data processing responsibilities maybe get 15 minutes training on the GDPR, and then staff like HR or marketing maybe end up with 20, 25 minutes of training.
Yeah, absolutely. And that does tend to be the case with regulators across the board, regardless of the subject area, doesn't it? In that they say, oh yeah, training is definitely important and you should train your staff, but they give very little detail or guideline around who exactly needs to be trained, or how long that training needs to be, or what exact content you need to cover in that training. So I'd say that probably is the piece that people need the most help with, and that clients come to us with those kind of questions very often. So I mean, we can get into the detail of it here, but I mean, Paddy, at a high level, typically what are you seeing from the companies that you're working with in terms of what audience they're choosing to train? Typically, how long would a GDPR training course be, and what are you covering within that? So obviously, it does vary from client to client, but typically, what would you be advising companies?
Well, typically what we've seen our clients that have taken the GDPR to date, they will take our core GDPR topics. So basically the topics to give a high-level overview of the GDPR, why it's important, how it works. We talk about consent and active consent and the importance of having consent and using personal data. And that training would probably be anything from 15 to 20 minutes, probably around 15 minutes. And then what we see clients doing as well is, if they have a large marketing department, if they work a lot with third-party vendors, they would say, for example, take our marketing topic, take our procurement topic, take our supply chain topic, take our HR topic, and then roll those topics out to the individuals within their company that need them. So, for example, if you work in HR, you might take the core GDPR content that's maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and then you'd maybe get another 6 or 7 minutes of HR specific content, which really drills in and focuses on how the GDPR impacts the role of a HR professional. Excuse me, HR professional.
Yeah.
So then, sorry, Neil, when it comes to our training itself, and what clients look for, and this is why we've designed the training why we've designed the training in the way we have, is there, I suppose, a couple of key factors that we focus on when we design the training. So GDPR is a new piece of legislation. Most people within a company probably will have heard of it will probably think it doesn't impact on their role in any way, shape or form. So what we do in the training is, and it's the second bullet point we have here, is building motivation around the GDPR. So we try and connect the legislation to the learner. So we try and emphasize to them how the GDPR can impact their role within their company. So why the GDPR is important to them. So we do this within our training through some real life scenarios that learners can relate to. So that helps kind of connect them to the legislation. The scenarios we build are based around the new legislation. So there might be real life scenarios that put a learner in the situation where they have to handle a piece of data. What do they need to do to adhere to the GDPR? We then, obviously, we spoke about our role-specific content. So we take marketing, for instance, we will create relatable scenarios around running marketing campaigns, what you need to do to gain a person's consent before you use their data. How can you use their data when you collect it as part of a marketing campaign, what you can and can't do, that sort of thing. We also, at the top 3 tips here, we've spoken about connecting the learner to the legislation, creating relatable scenarios. Another important thing is not overcomplicating the legislation. I mean, learners don't really need to know the GDPR legislation in detail. They need to know how it impacts what they do on a day-to-day basis, and that's what we try to do in the training. So we focus on, the consequences of non-compliance, and then how that impacts what they do on a day-to-day basis. So how they adhere to the GDPR when they go about their day-to-day tasks.
So I guess just summarizing briefly, Paddy, some of the points that you've touched on there. So, I mean, I suppose the first bullet point that we have there on the screen is getting the right sequence of topics. So I think what you're saying is that the entire employee population would get some training on GDPR. So what is it? Why is it important to the business? How does it impact the business? Sort of the basics and the principles and the fundamentals of GDPR. And then on top of that, depending on the area of risk or depending on your role within the organization, you might get some topics. For example, if you are working in HR, you might get an additional piece of content because obviously people in different departments or in different areas of the business are handling different types of data, and how that data needs to be handled varies from department to department and area to area. So they're getting some more role specific content there as well. And I guess to maybe summarize the second 2 points, what you're saying is that the content has to be relevant. So in making that relevant, in using relevant scenarios, using characters that people can identify with as being potentially a colleague, somebody that a scenario whereby somebody might ask you for a piece of advice or something like that. It's giving the learner the opportunity to put some of that learning into practice, explore the gray areas of the topic, and identify with the situation that in which they might actually find themselves, and helping them out there.
Yeah, that would be
so
it. Yeah.
in terms of then the testing piece, is that an important piece for GDPR training? I mean, do companies typically have to have a record for a regulator of who's been trained, who's taken the training and completed the training successfully? Is that generally a critical piece of GDPR training?
Yeah, it is. It's probably a critical piece of all compliance training. So the way all our topics set up is that at the end of each topic, we've a 5-question assessment with a passing mark of 80%, but that's configurable on client request. We can up that to 100% if clients want. So that gives the client in their LMS the capability to track who has taken the course, who has completed the course, who has passed the assessments. Clients normally ask us to set the training up so that a learner cannot complete the training unless they pass each of the assessments at the end of a topic. Now, the questions at the end of the topic are binary, so they're either true or false, yes, no, those type of questions. So this gives clients the capability to show to regulators how many people on their staff have taken the training, how many have completed the training, and they can also extrapolate pass rates, how many people have passed the assessments, etc. from that. So the testing is a key element of any compliance training program that we build. What we also include from in our standard compliance training that most clients want is an attestation at the end of the training, where learners will attest that they will adhere to, in this case, the GDPR. They'll report any potential breaches, etc. So that gives companies a little bit of added security that all their staff have attested to the fact that they will adhere to the GDPR, that they have read their company's relevant policies, etc.
Yep, that makes sense. And then you mentioned, Paddy, working with our legal partner, Cordery, on the content itself. I mean, one of the things that I've heard from quite a few clients is that they're sort of being bombarded with a lot of marketing speak around GDPR, and a lot of companies, trying to sell different services around GDPR, and they're finding it hard to differentiate between what's real and what's not real, and what's essential versus what's superfluous, and where to focus their energies. How have you gone about ensuring the integrity of the content and really boiling it down to the essential pieces that companies really need, versus trying to train everyone on everything?
Well, that's really Cordery, or as you mentioned, our legal partner, play a key role here in that they are, I suppose, a key. They're a key expert actually when it comes to GDPR, and they're based in the UK, so they have extensive experience in compliance and compliance legislation, and they have done extensive research on their end on the GDPR, and are working with multiple clients themselves on the GDPR, not just trading companies, companies in general. So they've provided some really valuable input into what companies need to know, what their staff need to know, what they need to train on. So we would go through a process of where we build our training. We'll review it with them. They give us some very valuable feedback, say in particular areas. For example, say when it comes to marketing, our marketing topic, they emphasize that the area of legitimate interest is a key area of concern for a lot of marketing companies. So we've included some content around that. So they provide some very valuable input for us, both from what they see their clients as needing from a GDPR perspective, but also then, I suppose more importantly for us, validating that everything we put in the GDPR, in our GDPR course, is legally correct from the standpoint of the GDPR itself.
Yep. Great. And I would just say to anybody who's on the line, I know we're almost at the half hour, so we will certainly take questions from people who are on the line through the chat window. And if anybody does have anything that they would like to put to Paddy or myself, now would be a good time to do that. We have had a question from James regarding online training versus in-person training, and what we're seeing companies doing from that point of view. Like, are companies supplementing the e-learning with additional in-person training to really go into the finer detail and the specifics? And I guess to address that question, we are seeing some clients do that. Online training is certainly not the be all and end all, but it does play a significant role, and it will have significant impact. It's a great way of giving your employee audience a very consistent learning experience, making sure that the message you're giving out to everybody is a consistent message throughout the organization, and making sure that all of your employees do have the fundamentals and the principles, and obviously, as Paddy mentioned, some of the role-specific content on top of that. But yeah, certainly, a little bit of in-person training, or a little bit of maybe a Q&A session with an expert or something like that would be a good idea to go along with the e-learning. So, Paddy, have you anything to add to that, would you say, or does that cover it?
No, I think I think that covers it, Neil. Yeah, and I suppose what we would see from a client perspective is a lot of clients might use the e-learning to roll out the GDPR awareness training to their global audience, and then maybe use in-person training to drill down into specifics of for roles that deal with personal data on a daily basis, like HR, procurement, marketing, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So there haven't been any questions that have come through. As I said, if you do have questions on the line, please do send them in, and we have a couple of minutes left in which we can cover those off. I guess the final piece from our point of view is to say that we have gone through our first deployments just towards the end of 2017 with our first clients actually rolling out GDPR training, and have done so in multiple languages. So, I mean, we'd certainly be happy to help anyone out on the line in terms of giving you a sense of what some other companies are doing and how they're approaching that. We are still running one-to-one planning sessions directly with clients to get them ready for GDPR training ahead of the May 2018 deadline. Obviously, it is coming around pretty quickly, so there isn't a huge amount of time to get ready, but it can be done quite quickly. So if you do need any help on that, certainly get in touch. And we can also, what we will do is we will give everybody on the line demo access to our training in case you want to take a look and get a sense of what we're doing and also what other companies are doing. So we'll follow up with everybody by email with that demo link. If you do want to set up a meeting with us to schedule 30 minutes just as a starting point to get a sense of what other companies are doing or how we might be able to help you out, we'd be certainly happy to do that. So yeah, again, just wanted to thank everybody for their time today. We really appreciate you coming along, and hopefully we were able to impart a bit of knowledge and a bit of help onto everybody who joined. Paddy, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate your input. And as I said, if anybody does have any questions or would like to see anything that we've done in a bit more detail, we'll be in touch with you all by email. So thanks everybody, much appreciated, and we'll speak with you again soon. Thank you.